Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. It's a great pleasure to be here and give one of these food thinkers talks. And particularly to be invited by the Food Research Collaboration and the Centre for Food Policy. I mean, this genuinely is the Centre for Food Policy in the UK. When Tim and I started on food policy in the 70s, my estimate at any rate was there were probably no more than 5 people in the UK who thought food and politics had anything to do with each other. And then nowadays, the Centre for Food Policy organises meetings here at City University, and sometimes 450 people show up. So you've really created a Centre for Food Policy, and that's splendid. Now, until about 10 minutes ago, I was under the mistaken impression that I had more than half an hour to give a presentation, and I prepared rather more material. In the last 10 minutes, I've deleted quite a few slides, so you'll get a truncated version of what I had prepared, but even to get through what remains, I'm going to have to do what I frequently do on these occasions, which is speak quickly. Okay.
Are you game for people to interrupt you?
Oh, absolutely. Oh yeah, nothing could be worse than a monologue. Okay, I want to talk about what has happened in food safety policy making since the mid-70s when Tim and I stumbled into this field, and I'm going to refer to 3 jurisdictions: the UK, European Community and Union, and the USA. Partly because those are the ones I know most about, but also those are the ones that are of greatest significance to us. And I'll take these out there, making a terrible noise. And in terms of food safety, I'm going to talk about 3 aspects of it. I'm not saying this exhausts all relevant aspects of food policy, but microbiological food safety, bacteria, viruses, funguses, nutritional food safety, and toxicological food safety are the 3 areas I'm going to be talking about today. And the main unit of analysis in which I'm going to present my discussion is in terms of what the World Trade Organization and its Sanitary and Phytosanitary Standards Agreement refers to as the chosen level of protection, which is, within a jurisdiction, how safe do you want your food to be? What level of risk do you consider acceptable, and how safe does it have to be in order for it to be acceptable? And I'm going to argue that this has varied from jurisdiction to jurisdiction over time and across those 3 fields of microbiological, nutritional, and toxicological. Right. Okay. So food policy making, as in regulatory policy making across numerous technological fields, is frequently represented as justified by and legitimated by reference to what policymakers often like to refer to as sound science or independent scientific advice. You may recall through the BSE saga in this country, the Prime Minister and government ministers would stand up in the Houses of Parliament and say, "We are doing what and only what our expert advisors tell us. It is not for me as a mere politician to second guess the experts. We're just doing what they tell us." And that has always been a misleading representation, but a very popular representation. Another aspect of my discussion is, well, what role, to what extent have changes in policies been influenced by the state of science or developments in science? And the answer I will give is not a lot. Okay, but to understand the role of science, I want to talk firstly in general terms about various ways of attempting to represent the role of science in policy making. And these models, which I use to talk about food, equally would apply to mobile phone safety, aviation, nuclear power stations, cosmetics, floor polish, whatever. Okay, so this was the kind of narrative which I call a technocratic narrative, which used to be articulated in the European Union till the mid-late 90s, in the UK until 96. The narrative was policy is based on and only science. And in these diagrams, I'm using this blue color to denote the cool characteristic of science. In other diagrams, you'll see red to convey the warmth or even the heat of politics. But somehow the myth was that the policy could be based on and only science. Do I have some examples here, or did I delete them? I deleted them. Oh, I had a lovely rude one about Tony Blair in biotech saying, oh, what really worries me, yes, having deleted it, why am I saying it? You know, what really worries me about GM is that policy should be based on science and science alone. And people don't realize how important GM is to our future economic development. So the hypocrite first says it must be based on science, not prejudice, and then immediately articulates his non-scientific prejudices as if he's talking about science. I mean, the levels of self-deception amongst policymakers are quite staggering sometimes. Anyway, this was an orthodox narrative, and it has never been remotely reliable, in large part because science does not speak with one voice. The science is uncertain. Science, okay, I'll give you the quick version of this. I'm not saying in this area of toxicology it's more uncertain than other aspects of toxicology. It's just that in this particular case, an effort was made to estimate the magnitude of the uncertainty. And this relates to the artificial sweetener saccharin. Saccharin was first introduced in the 1890s, and there have been disputes about its safety ever since. Since the late 70s, the dispute has been about whether or not it causes cancer in humans, because when fed to rats at not particularly heroic doses, and particularly over 2 generations, it increases the incidence of bladder tumours in male rats. And so the National Academy of Sciences looked at evidence from animal studies, from bacterial studies, and from human epidemiological studies, and estimated that if the US citizens carried on consuming saccharin at the rate that they then were, the extra cases of cancer over the next 70 years might be 0.22, less than 1, which corresponds to about one extra case of cancer every 350 years. Bless you, Ben. Or it might be as high as 1,444,000. It's not worse than that, and it's not better than that. It's in there somewhere. Now, with science as uncertain as that, it doesn't tell you what to do. So science doesn't speak with one voice. And even if it could, even if if you could diminish or eradicate the uncertainty, it still wouldn't settle the policy issue. As I was taught when I was a philosophy graduate student, you can't derive an ought from an is. All the facts you know don't actually tell you which policies are appropriate. Policy judgments are not just about the existence and magnitude of risks or uncertainties about risks, it's about the acceptability of risk. Because nothing's perfectly safe, and there are circumstances where we will accept some risks. Say a therapeutic benefit from medication, because we think the benefit outweighs the risk. But so similar kinds of judgments are made in relation to food products. And in effect, there are what we call chosen levels of protection. How safe do policymakers want it to be? And the decision about how safe it should be is not a scientific issue, it's a policy issue. So, okay. The fact that science was extremely uncertain eventually emerged, it became impossible. The government used to go to enormous lengths to conceal the uncertainties. I used to go to the Ministry of Ag, Fish and Food in Whitehall and ask for the evidence on the basis of which decisions had been taken, and they used to give me a 2-word answer, the second of which was off. And then I'd go to Washington, to the Food and Drug Administration, ask for the same evidence, and they'd point to the files in the photocopy and say, help yourself. So in the US system, given a freedom of information regime, you couldn't conceal the uncertainties, and therefore you couldn't retain that model, because if there isn't one arrow, but as it were multiple arrows, there's no way in which the science decides the policy. So this model emerged in the US as a replacement for the technocratic narrative, in which it was recognized that, okay, policy making isn't purely scientific, there is also a policy phase, and that's where you see the red of the warmth of the political atmosphere. So yes, they still have the same idea that scientists, you can use scientific information and evidence and experts to estimate the existence and magnitude of risks, and you then give that information to policymakers. So there is a division of labor between scientists and policymakers. And policymakers take into account both the scientific evidence and other considerations about what level of risk is tolerable, what it would cost to diminish risks to an acceptable level, and so on, and combine that to give policy conclusions which you then announce to the public and tell the industry what to do, and so on. Now, this model is now the conventional orthodoxy, and it's an improvement on the previous model, but it's still flawed. And it's flawed for several reasons. Firstly, this arrow, not only does it assumes certainty in the science, it also has this arrow pointing in one direction only, suggesting that science influences policy, but policy never influences science, as if science operates in a political vacuum. And that is a myth, as I shall argue shortly. Okay. Yeah, because actually when you do a risk assessment, you assess the risk of whatever it might be, Campylobacter in poultry, or colours, preservatives and emulsifiers in food, or pesticide residues, or even drinking highly sugared fizzy pop. You always have to make some assumption about, well, what counts as a relevant risk? What counts as relevant evidence? So in relation, and this is clearest in relation to GM foods, is one way of giving an example. In relation to GM foods, in the USA, the way in which they assess risk of cultivating GM crops is, would it cause, or at least, of the environmental impact of cultivating GM crops, would it bring about any change, ecological change, that adversely affects the interests of US farmers? Other changes don't count as a risk, they're only called adaptations. So they frame it very narrowly. In Europe, it was always framed more widely. It was framed as, especially, in the US, with prairie farming, there's precious little wildlife left around the farms, whereas in Europe, where we have agricultural and non-agricultural environments all mixed up together, European risk assessors assess risk not just to the agricultural environment, but also to the non-agricultural environment. But initially, they only were looking at, it turned out, they were only looking at short-term and direct effects. And in the late 90s, the European Parliament intervened and said, no, that just isn't enough. We also insist that you look at not just short-term effects, but also long-term effects, and not just direct effects, but indirect effects. So not just, for example, the effect on insects of eating pollen of GM crops, but maybe the effect on birds of insects eating the pollen and the birds then eating the insects. So it might have a different effect indirectly than directly. So in order to assess risk, you have to make some assumptions, some prior assumptions, which influence the science, though they are not themselves scientific assumptions. They can't be decided solely by reference to scientific considerations of what counts as a relevant risk and what counts as relevant evidence. So it was, I've said that, okay. But I want to persuade you, let's just cut to the picture, that actually I think this is a more realistic representation, and this is how I understand it. Yes, there are experts, sorry, I dismantled this microphone, not yet. There are expert scientific assessments of the existence and magnitude of risks, and they are informed in part by scientific factors, but they're also influenced by what I think of as prior upstream non-scientific assumptions, which are essentially policy judgments, socioeconomic and political judgments that frame the risk assessment of the sort that I've indicated. What counts as harm? What counts as evidence? Which are the groups you're seeking to protect. And this influences what the risk assessors do, and they may play a role in influencing these judgments, but since these are essentially policy judgments, they should be made not by scientific experts, but by policymakers. And, okay, the global body that sets standards on internationally traded foods, the Codex Alimentarius Commission, made an important step forward earlier this century when they abandoned that model. Oh yes, it's called the Red Book model because it originally emerged in a publication from the US National Academy of Sciences, which was bound in a red cover. And so it's come to be known as the Red Book model. Codex have been working with this model and then effectively adopted this model by saying determination of risk assessment policy, which is these upstream assumptions. They gave it a name, they call it risk assessment policy. Determination of it is a component of risk management, not risk assessment. Risk assessment policy should be established by risk managers in advance of the risk assessment, in consultation with the assessors and all other interested parties. Now, what's been happening for a long time, as I want to argue, is that, in effect, policymakers, risk managers, have gone to enormous lengths to avoid taking responsibility for these key considerations. Or if they are taking responsibility for these key considerations, they conceal the extent to which they're taking responsibility. The way in which they've done it is selected just those scientists who they're satisfied share their own prior assumptions and put them onto a scientific advisory committee, the result of which is policy judgments have been made not by policymakers, but often by scientific advisors, and then the policy judgments masquerade as though they were scientific when they ain't. Right, okay. Oh, yeah. Well, I'll come back to that. Let's keep moving. All right. Okay. The way in which food safety policy making has operated, at least in the UK and the European Union, was fundamentally transformed by the crisis over mad cow disease, or BSE. The crisis broke in this country on the 20th of March, 96, in continental Europe later that decade. And it provoked not just doubts about the safety of British beef, but huge concerns about the robustness and reliability of the regulatory system. It wasn't just that people no longer trusted the safety of, at any rate, British beef. They didn't trust the policymakers either, or their experts, because the policymakers, you may recall, for 10 years from, well, 11 years, 11 and a half, from mid-85 when BSE first emerged, until March 2006, policymakers and their expert advisors kept saying, it is perfectly safe and we know that for sure. And those reassurances evaporated. It hadn't been safe and they hadn't known it for sure. They'd massively exaggerated the reliability of their evidence and understated the uncertainties. So this provoked huge crises. And the outgoing major government was damaged, seriously damaged by its handling of this, and the incoming Labour government, led by Blair, said, well, we'll have to do something about it, and one of Blair's first moves, when he arrived at number 10, was to hand to Jack Cunningham, as the new Secretary of State at the Ministry of Ag, Fisheries and Food, the report to which was written, led by Phil James, but contributed to by Tim and I, on a proposal to create a food standards agency. And a few years later, when a similar crisis broke on continental Europe, the argument was, we'll create what became the European Food Safety Authority. We'll create new institutions and change the architecture of policy making. And these organizations were supposed to create, well, as it were, they were supposed to deliver two separations. Things that had not been separated previously were now supposed to be separated. Because, you may recall, the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food was supposed simultaneously to look after the interests of farmers in the food industry and of consumers. And there was so much tension between those two responsibilities, they ended up letting down all their constituencies, being a complete failure. So the proposal was to take responsibility for regulating the food industry away from the ministry responsible for sponsoring it and put it in the Food Standards Agency, which would then be answerable not to the Min of Ag, Fish and Food, but to the Department of Health. So they were supposed to separate sponsorship and regulation, and they were also supposed to separate science from policy. The argument having been that during BSE, the science was highly political. Yes, they claimed to have evidence-based policy making, when in practice they had policy-based evidence selection. First, decide what the policy is, and then only recruit evidence and experts who will give you the policy judgment you've already decided you want to receive. But those separations have not been achieved, and that's part of the story I'm going to tell. Yeah, I said all that. Okay. Yeah, let's... In practice, I want to argue that in the Food Standards Agency, the European Food Safety Authority, and in the USA, the Food and Drug Administration, are still subject to policy and political influence by the representatives of the food industry. The way in which decisions are taken in those institutions is not based either purely by reference to science or purely by reference to protection of consumer interests and public health. What else am I going to put it? Yeah. I mean, also, yes, the separation of science from policy was supposed to be accomplished in the proposal that Tim and I and Phil James prepared. We recommended in the UK that the Food Standards Agency would look at the science and would provide advice, scientific advice to ministers, and ministers would then take responsibility for decisions, policy decisions. That's what the James report said. That's what the government white paper proposing to set up the Food Standards Agency said, but in ways that I don't think we noticed at the time, twixt white paper and legislation. Behind the scenes, ministers and the lawyers got hold of it and changed it so that the Food Standards Agency would essentially advise itself and be both the scientific and policy-making body, and ministers wouldn't have to decide anything. There was this extraordinary event. I wasn't present in the room at the time, but I've been reliably informed. And I don't repeat gossip, so I'll say this only once. The Secretary of State, Department of Health at the time was Frank Dobson. They'd recruited John Krebs, Professor of Zoology from Oxford University, to be the first chair of the board of the Food Standards Agency. What better way to make the Food Standards Agency seem purely scientific than to appoint an Oxford Professor of Zoology as the chair? But Krebs entered the room at their first meeting. Dobson got out of the chair, put out his hand and uttered a remarkable sentence, namely, "Professor, I want you to know that I shall never hesitate to use you as my shield." If he'd said that to me, I'd have said, "Thank you, Frank, find some other idiot for the job, I'm out of here," you know. But Krebs was willing to play the Olympian role of scientist who advised himself and able to make policy decisions. So in practice, they didn't separate science from policy making. The Food Standards Agency advises itself. And that's the pattern that also prevails in the US Food and Drug Administration. The Food and Drug Administration has this myth. What do they call it? They say, there are Chinese walls between scientific risk assessment and policy making. But as I recall, the Great Wall of China failed to protect China because somebody opened the door and let people through. The analogy, I think, might be relevant. So, they went round. Oh, did they? Okay, you might know better. Okay, so, quickly, I've just put up on the screen a few documents being published, especially by Corporate Observatory Europe and people, showing that in practice, at the European Food Safety Authority, corporate interests still influence. And the same is true in the UK. When the Food Standards Agency was set up, Tim and I argued that nobody from the food industry should be a member of the board of the Food Standards Agency. Ministers overruled it, said, oh, we've got to have them there, but it's all right, they'll always remain in a minority. How long was it? 3.5, 4 years before they were in a majority.
You wrote a paper in the last.
Yeah, something similar has happened at European Food Safety Authority. There are members of the food industry there, and the legitimation is, oh, we need their expertise. Excuse me, you can recruit their expertise to give you evidence, but they shouldn't be in the room making the policy decisions that concern themselves. But it's not only at the sort of board level policy-making part of these organizations where industry exercises its influence, it also does in the scientific advisory committees. One of the good things the Food Standards Agency has done was to introduce a rule saying that its expert advisory committees must meet in public. Now, I haven't had the time to go to very many of them, but the few I have attended, and I'd encourage you, if you're interested, go and sit in on these meetings. If you apply, you have to fill in a form on the web to the Food Standards Agency, and they'll say, what do you want to come for? I just say, as per the agenda. That'll do. Don't tell them. You don't have to say any more than that. Anyway, there was this the extraordinary occasion of the Committee on Toxicity when some evidence had emerged that in tests on one of the ingredients in a pesticide product, the evidence suggested that this ingredient, active ingredient, had increased the incidence of cancer in laboratory animals in studies. At which point, when that was drawn to the committee's attention, one of the members of the committee, who at the beginning of the meeting had declared an interest in the trade association representing the chemical and pesticide industry, said, but we, on the committee, we committee members, we have a special responsibility to avoid a false positive. Now, I think I was the only person in the room that blanched at that. I heard that as saying, we have to go out of our way to think of reasons why the evidence that this might be harmful should be discounted.
Does everyone know what a false positive?
Yeah. It might not be really carcinogenic to humans, only to, say, the rats in that experiment. And so I thought, hang on, if you're supposed to be protecting consumers, your priority should be to avoid false negatives, namely studies that fail to detect an effect when there is an effect to be detected, or at best you should be equally symmetrically interested in both, not biased to bend over backwards to serve the interests of the chemical industry, but that's what they were doing. Anyway, let's keep going, I'm running late. Oh yes, about the relationship between politics and science. This really cracked me up. I was doing some work for the European Parliament on the proposal to set up the European Food Safety Authority, where it was supposed to do the science and the Commission was supposed to do the policy making. I was talking to a senior person at the Commission who's responsible for setting it up, and I said to that person in Brussels, how do you envisage the relationship between the Commission and the European Food Safety Authority once it's been set up? And the answer I got burned its way into my memory. She said, we want it to be independent, but not out of control. I mean, namely, we want it to give the impression of independence, while actually we can make sure that it only gives us the advice that we have already decided we want to receive. And that's the way it operates. Curiously enough, that's the same, that's how it's working at the Food and Drug Administration in Washington, in London, in Europe, in the Food Standards Agency, and in European Union bodies. Oh yeah, here's a stack of documents that have come out of the European Food Safety Authority, which have actually been setting policy judgments for science, articulating what I call risk assessment policy, or what Codex calls risk assessment policy. But instead of these decisions having taken by policymakers, they are coming from the European Food Safety Authority, and so essentially they are policy judgments masquerading as if they were scientific. And it's highly misleading, but we haven't got time to go through those in detail. So what I should do is, let's come to these charts. Let me try and explain what's going on. I have three of them, one for the US, which this is the first one, the USA, then European Union and the UK. And for each of them, I've got these three sets of hazards, with microbiological, nutritional, and toxicological, and arrayed in sequential decades. And in effect, I'm trying to represent what's happened to what I referred to at the beginning as the chosen level of protection, how safe they're trying to get their food to be. And actually, it's very difficult ever to get a clear statement out of any policy institution as to what their chosen level of protection is, except that the European Commission has some vacuous rhetoric about we want our food to be the safest in the world. They say that's what they want, and then they pretend that that's what they have already achieved, but there's a huge gap between the aspiration and the achievement. So these arrows represent, was it rising, falling, or remaining constant? About the same over these periods. And, well...
The actual risk or the judgment of risk?
Well, the level of safety that the policymakers were trying to achieve and deliver. That's what I'm trying to get at here.
So the official goal.
Yeah. Actually, in the US, they have, in general, been very concerned about microbiological food safety. Microbiological food safety is quite different from nutritional and toxicological. If you get obese, overweight or obese, or suffer long-term chronic poisoning, it's almost never possible to identify which food products were responsible over the long duration of which you read it. But with microbiological hazards, you can, if you'll allow me to put it cynically this way, you can, if not drop dead at any rate, be violently sick while still holding the packet. So the responsibility for the failure in food safety can be sometimes directly attributed to particular products and particular plants in which those products were manufactured or sold. And you will appreciate that the United States is a remarkably litigious society. When people get sick and they know who to blame, they are more likely than they ever are in UK or Europe to threaten or take legal action. And also, the health insurance companies that have to pay the costs of microbiological food poisoning are keen to sue the companies whose products have made the clients of the insurance companies sick. And therefore, in these circumstances, the US Food and Drug Administration and in some parts of the food industry have gone to some lengths to try to protect against microbiological food poisoning. But over this period, of course, there's been this great cascades of technological changes and intensification of production, and especially with livestock, intensification of larger, instead of having a large number of small slaughterhouses and meat preparation plants, they've got a small number of very large ones. And then when you get some microbiological contamination in an animal, and they don't wash the blades between animals, it's spread across a much longer range of products. So there has been a lot of effort to improve microbiological standards, at least early in this era. Nutritional standards just gone down and down for reasons that aren't really about food safety, but are more about the political power of farming lobbies in the US that have been that have managed to persuade the government to give them massive subsidies, which have generated huge surpluses, which have then been recycled into junk food, and this kind of the calories in oils and fats and sugars have been rising, and therefore nutritional standards have fallen, and the federal government and the state governments have done precious little about it all through this period. So those standards have been falling. Toxicologically, well, something important happened. I know it's a while ago. Back in 1958, Congress passed a law. It's called the Delaney Amendment, an amendment to food, drug, and cosmetics legislation, which said if any compound has been shown by relevant scientific experiments to cause cancer in relevant models such as animal studies, they are to be banned. And that should have led, for example, to the banning of saccharin. But when the Reagan administration came in the 80s, while that did produce for a while an improvement in toxicological standards, with the Reagan administration, their industrial sponsors didn't like this one little bit. So they invented a body called the Interagency Regulatory Liaison Group, which brought expert scientific advisors together from the Food and Drug Administration, the Department of Agriculture, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, and so on. And they decided, in effect, what they did was lift the bar. Under Delaney, a compound could be deemed unacceptable if it caused cancer in one variety of one species of laboratory animal. Under this group, they first raised it to 2 species. Then they raised it to 2 species and a bacterial test showing that it caused mutations, so had to cause cancer by a particular kind of aggressive mechanism. And then it was 2 species in both genders and 2 different biological mutation studies. So in effect, they progressively raised the hurdle that compounds had to satisfy in order to be deemed to be carcinogens in order to fall foul of the Delaney Amendment. So things improved then and then went downhill in the 80s. And then they've gone down again in the 90s with the introduction of GM foods on the basis of sort of what I like to think of as homeopathic amounts of data. A bit of chemical analysis and no toxicological evidence whatsoever. So that's my characterization for the US. Oh yeah, EU. All right. Well, the EU wasn't terribly concerned with microbiological problems in the 70s. The ability to track the sources of infections weren't so good in those days. And in the 80s, along came BSE as well as, to this EU level. And at first, some in continental Europe wanted to ban exports of British beef from the UK to other parts of the European Union, but they were prevented politically from doing so. And then in the 90s, 96, it emerged that BSE had caused what was then called new variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. And so they said, well, we've got to improve standards. But actually, it got harder and harder to do so because the supply chains were getting longer and longer and more complex to the point where it became very, very difficult to trace the source of problems. There was that extraordinary rumpus a few years ago, if you may remember. There was an outbreak of microbiological food poisoning in Germany, and the German authorities initially blamed it on Spanish salads, perhaps cucumbers anyway, and banned the import of Spanish crop, which sent the Spaniards into apoplexy, and they ended up suing the Germans and getting some money out of it. And I think it was something like 9 or 10 months later when it was eventually traced to some Egyptian fenugreek seeds that were sprinkled in the salad as a garnish. So the longer and the more complex the supply chain becomes, the harder and harder it is to know where things come from. And the Horsegate saga reinforces this. I mean, when it emerged that horse meat had been substituted for beef in lasagna, Tesco were totally stunned because they thought their paper trail and their ticked boxes meant they had complete knowledge of where everything in their food supply came from. And it turned out that they'd invested millions in this box-ticking tracking exercise, and it was worthless because they weren't sure where things were coming. Now, I believe that last decade, actually, things deteriorated in the UK, sorry, in the EU, because, well, even though these new institutions were set up, responsibility for food safety was taken away from the department of the Commission responsible for sponsoring industry and given to a new Directorate General on Health and Consumer Protection. The rest of the Commission, particularly the President of the Commission, Barroso, and sorry, I'm not sure, I can't remember the name of the Directorate General responsible for the internal market and commerce and competition. They put enormous pressure on DG Sanko to be permissive and not restrictive on the food industry. And I think that's continued. I mean, the recent judgments of the Commission on glyphosate, the most widely used herbicide, which last year the International Agency for Research on Cancer said was carcinogenic. A couple of months ago, well, it's been revised, it's now DG Sante for health, but they said we'll continue to license it. And the Food and Veterinary Office, which was supposed to make sure that regulatory standards were properly enforced, has become weaker and weaker.
It's now been abolished.
And yeah, I mean, with austerity across Europe, cuts have meant that enforcement, resources going into enforcement have diminished. And as Eisenhower said when he was Allied Forces Supreme Commander towards the end of the Second World War, he said wisely, the uninspected deteriorate, and it certainly does. Yeah, well, nutritional standards did improve a bit in Europe in the 70s, and they've been going downhill ever since. Toxicologically, well, the Scientific Committee for Food consisted of a bunch of scientists, almost all of whom were paid consultants to the chemical companies whose products they were evaluating. The Single European Act in the 90s said, in effect, anything permitted in any European member state must now be permitted in all of them, which meant that the range of different ingredients and different processes deemed acceptable actually got longer, not shorter, so standards declined. With the creation of the European Food Safety Authority at the start of this century was supposed to bring some improvements, but I have been seriously underwhelmed by its performance. But I don't have time to go into that in detail, but the examples of glyphosate and aspartame would tell a extraordinary story. Let's just quickly do the UK. I'm running far too long. I'll be as quick as I can. Yes, Gov. Well, do you remember the 80s? Quite how Tim had the foresight to set up the London Food Commission just before this scandal on salmonella in eggs broke. I don't know your foresight. But it was evident. And BSE emerged in the 80s. After the BSE scandal of March 1996, standards did improve a bit when the Food Standards Agency was first set up, but, especially when there were conspicuous problems with E. coli 157. But since 2010 in particular, well, basically they just held the status quo in the first decade of the century. It's gone downhill. I mean, when the coalition government came to power in 2010, they wanted to abolish the Food Standards Agency, only failed to do so because it had been set up under statutory authority, but they hacked back its budget, they hacked back its staff. Ministers have made it absolutely clear that the Food Standards Agency's job is to keep its head down and its mouth shut and make sure there are no food safety scandals. And it's been, well, nowadays, I mean, the chair of the Food Standards Agency, of the board, is a farmer who went... Last year there was a row about evidence of Campylobacter contamination of poultry meat, particularly chicken meat, and so some of the staff at the Food Standards Agency wanted to publish estimates of levels of contamination in the products of named retailers. And there was a vote on it. Curiously enough, on the board, all of those people from the food industry voted not to disclose the information. But it was a tied vote, and so the chairman, who was a farmer, used his casting vote to prevent the information from reaching the public domain. And now we have increasing antimicrobial resistance and multiple resistant infections coming into the food supply. Oh. Nutritionally, yeah. In the 80s, the government suppressed, what does NACNI stand for? The National
Advisory Committee on Nutrition
Education. Had a report recommending improved nutritional standards, which the government tried to prevent being published. And it eventually emerged in a leak in a book by Caroline Walker and Geoffrey Cannon. The Food Standards Agency did try to do some good stuff in the early years of its existence and argued strongly for front-of-pack traffic light labelling, but been overruled by ministers. And in 2010, responsibility for nutrition was taken away from the Food Standards Agency because they wanted to do something about it and was given to the Department of Health, that has been resolutely delinquent in that regard. And they gave responsibility for labelling to the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, which of course created remarkable scenes when the Horsegate saga broke. Members of the government turned to the Food Standards and said, "You sort it out." To which the Food Standards Agency said, "Excuse me, this is a problem of labelling. It's not our responsibility. It belongs to the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs." And then, what? Was this something we were supposed to do something about? It never crossed their mind. Well, toxicological deteriorations as well, but I haven't got time for that. Oh yeah, let me just show you a bit of evidence that things are, I maintain things are currently deteriorating, and in recent years deteriorating. So this is the incidence of microbial food poisoning for some pathogens. Oh, that's antibiotic resistant organisms rising over the recent years. This is incidence of obesity in adults, male and female over 16. And, oh yeah, this is an extraordinary one. This is, I'm sorry, the data are out of date. The cancer statistics come out very late, very slowly, because they check them very carefully. But in the long run, what has been happening is that even though tobacco, the number of people smoking cigarettes has declined, the incidence of cancer, primary cancers, in both men and women has been on a long-term rising trend. Now, mortality has declined because the treatments have got better. But, I mean, one of the many things I complain about is if you look at research expenditure into cancer, 99.99% of it is in therapeutics. And prevention gets a vanishingly slight amount. They're not attending to prevention. The incidence continues to rise and does continue to rise. And of course, food isn't solely responsible for this, but it is one significant contributor to it. Right. So let me pull it together and stop us soon. The Food Standards Agency and the European Food Safety Authority have both been ill-designed. Their design has been predicated on a misunderstanding of the nature of food safety policy judgments. There has been a pretense that they separate regulation from sponsorship, but actually, covertly, commercial interests continue to influence policy judgments. They've not separated science from policy making, but they have continued to conceal the links between science and policy making. They continue to operate, but behind the scenes, covertly. My argument is we should stop pretending that food safety policy making, the scientific basis of food safety policy making is independent of policy considerations. We should just make them explicit and have real policymakers, government ministers, those people who are paid large salaries to take responsibility for difficult decisions. I don't think we should pay them large salaries for systematically avoiding responsibility for difficult decisions and trying to use scientists as their shield. We shouldn't let these policy decisions be taken by scientists behind closed doors. They should be taken by policymakers in open and democratically accountable ways, so they can stand up and justify themselves. So we should we cease to pretend that science and policy are separate, but make the linkages explicit and accountable. Oh yeah, and the policy shouldn't be, well, what it really is in the EU, the Commission is in a pathetic state. They've given up on ever trying to raise food safety standards. I think that the most generous interpretation one can make of the aspiration is that they want to ensure that if standards decline, they do so only slowly and relatively inconspicuously. The goal should be rising standards of food safety. That should be explicitly the target. I mean, if you look at the way in which the Japanese government transformed the vehicle industry, they didn't just say, you got to clean up your emissions from exhaust pipes, but we are now going to tell you that every 5 years, the standard that you have to meet will be progressively tighter and tighter. And that is what resulted in not necessarily improved air quality, but at least diminished emissions per vehicle. Yes, and you can't, it's not that you can entirely separate sponsorship from regulation, because in practice they fail to separate them. But instead of subordinating regulation to sponsorship, it should be the other way around. Sponsorship should be subordinated to regulation. Oh yeah. And the way that food's regulate at the moment is it's just ingredient by ingredient, and not product by product, as if ingredients only ever exercise an effect on the health of consumers one at a time. But of course, they interact in important ways, and those interactions are one of the sets of risks to which the agencies are currently turning a set of blind eyes. I mean, it remains the case that compounds that have been shown to cause cancer, at least in laboratory animals, and that do so by causing harm to the genetic material in the nucleus of cells, are still permitted in the food supply, even though the oncologist's understanding of these compounds is that there is no safe level, and one molecule can, on its own, be sufficient to either trigger it or enhance the development of consumers. So we should get those out of the food supply. They remain in. And also, as well as carcinogens and mutagens, there's a whole category of endocrine disruptors that remain in the food supply. Yes, I've got minus 10 minutes.
You should stop.
Oh, I should stop then. Okay. I'll stop. But just say, to link it to the latest crisis, standards in the UK have been declining and continue to decline. But the vote for the UK to leave the European Union constitutes a bigger threat to the food safety standards that we do have in the UK at the moment, because the people who most enthusiastically advocated a vote to leave think that regulation of industry is an unnecessary burden, and that what Britain needs to do is deregulate. And that will, I'm convinced, will result in declining standards, not falling standards. So there's a lot to be done. And I'm sorry I've talked for too long. I'll stop there.
It does. Very good. You can clap on that.
But you don't have to.
They did. Eric, that was actually a tour de force. I've heard Eric give many talks over the years, and I never fall asleep because I always have to concentrate hard on what the logic of this physicist turned philosopher is trying to argue. Now, to get their brains going, I think you were raising some very important issues about the role of regulation, the role of science, and the role of policy and processes, which are extremely important across the board, but we're here as food. I have 4 questions for you. 1, are you seriously arguing that it is almost impossible to use science well? 2, are you suggesting your chosen levels of protection, CLSPs, you put up, is that your new benchmark against which you want to judge realities? So are you, as you're present to the future of food policy, are you saying food policy, the people in this room and the people who watch, are you saying this is a new sort of approach for critical policy to take? I thought you were. And the third, I thought you totally got the argument wrong about Brexit. We argue a lot. I thought you got it wrong. I don't think the people who voted for Brexit wanted what you want. I think they think by voting to leave the European Union, they'll take back control. Has been the dominant issue. I think it's messier than you presented. So just to throw that one at you. And I can't read my writing for the 4th. Yes, I can. The 4th was really a big one that you and I have argued about for 40 years, which is, what do you see as the progressive role of science for food policy? Okay. What is it? Now, you could ignore all those questions because we can argue about them for the next 40 years. That was really just to get their brains going. You're all looking blank at me. You think, let's just, you have to speak.
Madam, could Eric put his own model up on the screen?
Okay, certainly. Sure, Jack.
That was a great question. Does anyone have an actual question? Or I'll ask him to answer mine. So he always has this effect, by the way, so don't feel bad about it. Yes, you do. Good. People get easily lost in this. It's about the role of the state.
I was shocked that the toxicological regulations are still not enforced and poor. Is there any pressure from cancer charities and medical, I don't know, the BMA or the Royal Colleges to change that?
Do you want to answer that?
Yes. I am not aware of pressure in this country to change the regulation of food ingredients. Well, that's not quite, sorry, not from the cancer charity. Okay, the environmentalists are strongly arguing that glyphosate, a herbicide which is widely used, not just on things like pavements and paths in parks and golf courses, but also on agricultural fields. The environmental groups are arguing that glyphosate should be banned. I haven't heard the cancer pressure groups arguing that in the UK, though they are in continental Europe.
They are.
They are indeed. Also, the other argument I was making in relation to cancer, that most all the money is in treatment rather than prevention. I'm deeply disappointed that the cancer charities won't pick that up. And it's all about treating people who unfortunately succumb to cancer.
But that's not strictly true. The World Cancer Research Fund here in Britain, in the US and the rest of the world, the American Institute for Cancer Research, was set up
WCRF,
to focus on the preventive possibilities of diet in relation to cancer.
Yes.
So, but
they're
it's
more
1
looking
out of
at macro.
7, isn't it? 1 out of 7. I'm looking at our
But
leader.
they're more looking at macro ingredients like fats and sugars than trace chemical residues.
Well, you're now raising another question that I had in listening to you,
Wait, I haven't answered the first 3.
No, you're not allowed to. We can deal with that later. Jack.
Let's get immediately topical rather than philosophical. What do you think of the kind of exercise the Public Health England recently engaged in assessing the evidence on policy options as opposed to assessing the evidence on science?
You should welcome it.
No, I think, yes, I think that's a very interesting initiative, but of course to assess the arguments for and against policy initiatives and policy options also necessitates, if you're doing it properly, some of the scientific evidence. Because where do the risks lie, or where do the greatest uncertainties lie, is pertinent to how you evaluate the policy option. So I think that is a step forward, though I do fear for the future of Public Health England under this
That's a separate point.
It is.
The
indeed.
point is, I'm going
I
to
know it
push you
is.
further than Jack has, that I think that's the beginnings of the weakening of this model. I think it's the beginning of the weakening of that model,
Well, okay.
even before it's in as the orthodoxy. I mean, this is seriously useful stuff, by the way, if you don't realise it. You know, what Eric, this is 40 years' work of thinking about what are the frameworks which shape how decisions are made about food.
Well, no,
I mean, what is it you really want?
Okay, I'll tell you. And it's linked to what Jack's saying. The form of advice that I think should emerge from experts as dictated by the policymakers is the experts should be saying what is known and not known about the consequences of following or failing to follow a range of policy options. But that is not typically the form in which advice is given. It's ingredient by ingredient. Is it deemed, do the advisors think it's acceptably safe, under what conditions of use, and so on. So I think that the instruction from policymakers to the experts is to advise, should be to advise on policy options and not individual ingredients.
Just a comment. in some senses, that Public Health England development reinforces your judgment, because
I agree.
the report was not just a ranking, but they eventually came down with a rank order and recommendations about policy options that their political masters should follow, which they then didn't.
Yes, and my expectation is the output of that exercise has not been transmitted either to the board of the Food Standards Agency or to its expert advisory committee in the great British tradition of keeping these things in watertight, seeming to keep these things in watertight compartments and not making the connections. Can I come and answer your question to start with, Tim?
But I've got another, I've got a sixth
Oh,
already. Because I want to bring in, we've got in the room,
Ninthly.
we've got Jane Dixon from Australia, and I just looked at Jane a moment ago, and I was just thinking, just think about the process that Australia's gone through, or the United States has just gone through over dietary guidelines, and how there was an attempt to take evidence from science about food's impact on the environment, etc., etc. And it was agreed by the scientists, but turned down by the politicians. I mean, in a sense, what's happened in Australia and the United States over dietary guidelines, incorporating and linking nutritional advice with environmental advice, is an example not of this, but actually of a return to the previous model, a reassertion of the previous model. So I think, you know, there's a very interesting politics about, it's not unilinear, as sort of implicit in Eric's talk, that it's gone advance of our understanding from Model 1 to Model 2 to Model 3. It's quite possible that historical events move backwards. But I don't want to suggest, Jane, that's what you think.
I will just make one comment, Tim. I think
The issue is about more Eric's critical point. The toxicology and the judgments about nutrient by nutrient, toxicological factor by factor, whereas we eat a total diet.
yes. But I think almost Eric's depiction there needs to become more circular, more of a spiral, because in the Australian instance that you talk about, the science was in, the scientific committee agreed, but then the risk managers stepped in again and they reframed the exercise. So it started out, come up with guidelines for a nutritional and sustainable diet, and then it became come up with that within the framing of the Australian food policy. So I just think the orange square there, Eric, came into play again.
Right.
So it's to do with the sequencing of these phases, and I think it's more spiral-like.
I love this thinking. I mean, this is classic Spirou, clarifying, incredibly
I know, yeah.
So can I answer? Well, yeah. Can I answer the point, which is that in practice, the processes that become more. This is an oversimplified model. Processes become iterative, but I think there are good reasons for being careful for academics, especially to avoid circular models when dealing with policymakers. And I have a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, circular models are interpreted often by policymakers as implying that you can't change anything without changing everything, and there's nowhere to begin. I'm arguing that while it is, of course, the case that changing emerging scientific evidence changes the framing assumptions about what counts as a risk and what counts maybe as a relevant target group whose interests we're seeking to protect, in practice, even though the scientific community endlessly wants to represent itself as, you know, we're on everyone's side because we're on nobody's side, but to highlight the extent to which, in practice, it's not possible for scientists to articulate judgments about the existence or magnitude of risk without making some prior normative assumptions about what needs to be protected and what kind of evidence is relevant and how much a particular kind of evidence should be necessary or sufficient to justify recommendations for acceptance or restricting or banning things. So I do want to argue that, of course, things have iterative relationships, but nonetheless, I think that the policy assumptions are more fundamental than the science because the policy assumptions frame and guide the science.
Do you agree with that, Jane?
So,
I agree with Eric's first point, that there is a danger in making things appear so complicated, you know, complex systems thinking. That is the best way to turn off policymakers, is to talk about complex systems and spirals, and
Even if they are.
even if they are.
yeah.
So pragmatically,
Well-
there's an advantage in having simple models.
Yes, but maybe you could have phase one,
Yeah.
the line, then phase two,
Yeah,
then
because
phase three.
yes, these arrows go both ways is a way of indicating that developments in science influence policy, and if you change risk management, you change the circumstances and you can generate more evidence, which enables you to make more and better informed judgments about, you know, what risks might remain and what is appropriate to do about them. So, as it were, I seek to cover
Thank you, Tim.
the argument about iterative links by having the arrows go in both directions. Oh, let me have a go at your questions for a minute.
You can have a go at me.
Is it impossible to use science? Well, of course it isn't. But if you want to do so, firstly, you...
You seriously think it's not possible to use science well?
No, of course it is... Sorry, pay attention. Listen, I'm sorry, maybe I didn't articulate myself clearly
I
enough.
am paying attention.
Maybe I didn't articulate my views seriously. Of course it is possible to use science well.
Yeah, okay.
When the International Agency for Research on Cancer says glyphosate is a probable carcinogen, that is for me sufficient grounds for restricting it or banning it. Right. You know, rather than, I mean, what the European Union did is an absolute disgrace.
So it was a failure of policy.
The European Food Safety Authority didn't have the courage itself to address the issue, and they subcontracted it to the German Bundesinstitut für Risikobewertung, the German risk assessment body, which itself didn't bother to do an assessment, but simply accepted a huge long document prepared by a consortium of companies manufacturing and selling glyphosate, called the Glyphosate Task Force, wasn't it? Yeah. And so, essentially, the industry marked its own homework. It was then ticked by the Germans, who handed it to the European Food Safety Authority, and they ticked it as well. I mean, that is not a good way of using science. So while there are many bad ways, of course it can be done well. But in order to do so, first you have to have a group of scientific experts, none of whom are paid consultants to the companies whose products they're evaluating. You know, I mean, the crap we get from the European Food Safety Authority was it, oh yes, no, they don't have a conflict of interest. They have an interest, but it's not a conflict. I mean, you know, as a philosophy student, we call that a distinction without a difference.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'd love to ask
sorry,
Peter
wait
to
a
come in
minute.
here.
Your science. Your
Oh, sorry, wait a minute. I'm
I'm not really sure. Like, how would you regulate? Oh, sorry. How would you be able to regulate having scientists who are independent from the companies?
Yes. Okay. Firstly, you have to have full declarations of interests, and anyone with a relevant conflict of interest is excluded. That's simple. That's, you know. And also, but I think also to come back to this model, part of the risk management framing assumptions that should guide the scientists, that should come from the policy makers, should say things, make it explicit. Should they go out of their way to avoid false negatives more than false positives, or should they be symmetrical to that? I mean, they need guidance and instruction about what counts as a relevant risk, what counts as relevant evidence, and then the scientists have to show to policymakers and the general public in an open, democratically accountable way that they are following the guidance they're getting.
Are you with him? He always makes it incredibly complicated, but it's something
No,
very
it's not. I
simple
just made
within it as well. Are you happy with that? He's basically saying clean up the experts. Clean up the experts. So there's got to be a scrutiny of the experts before the experts' advice can be accepted. Is how I...
How is that regulated?
Absolutely.
Okay, but also, no, it's not just scrutiny of the experts, but policymakers have to take responsibility for telling the experts what the topic should be and what the assessment should be. Okay, I'll give you another food example.
Do you get that?
I'll give you another food example. Emulsif. Okay, the biggest diet-related health problem at the moment is overweight and obesity. One of the reasons why overweight and obesity has been rising is because the calorific content of the diet's been rising, and to a substantial extent that's been because the oil and fat content of the diet's been rising. One of the means by which that has been achieved by the food industry is using an awful lot of emulsifiers. Emulsifiers keep oils and fats in emulsion, not just in margarine, but in chocolate and cakes and biscuits and dessert products, you know. But when the risks from emulsifiers are assessed, they're assessed only toxicologically. And as it happens, as far as we can tell, compounds like lecithin, which is the most widely used emulsifier, is probably toxicologically innocuous. But it's nonetheless almost certainly contributing enormously to obesity. But the scientists turn blind eyes to that issue, even though hooligans like Tim have drawn their attention to these issues. Oh no, we look at toxicology, that's what we do. And it's the policymakers whose job it ought to be to say, yeah, look at toxicology because that's important, but there are other things you've got to look at as well. You know, and it's not just, well, you know, not just, I mean, the way Americans do it, the Food and Drug Administration assess health risks of chemicals is normally always and only to the average healthy adult. But actually there are large sectors of our population who are neither adult nor healthy. You have children, you have adolescents, you have the elderly. We want to protect the whole population against risk, not just healthy adults. And again, that should be part of the instruction given by policymakers to experts. So I think, therefore that's why I'm arguing, you can clean up, you can get the bought scientists out of the business, but you still have to have policymakers taking responsibility for instructing the scientists about the scope of their investigation and the risks against which they're there to help protect. And then they have to make sure that they do it.
Okay, that's very good. You were smiling and getting it. I think I got it. So let's assume. We'll switch to the back.
Peter.
Yeah, that was
Involved in the GMO issue.
great, Eric, and also in glyphosate a lot. And it seems to me that a crucial, I mean, in answer, thinking about the question, can you use science well? You can, but I would add to the points you made, as long as you recognise that it will have a limited role in determining the final outcome.
Yeah.
Maybe more than half of the factors you weigh, quite often a lot less. With glyphosate, significantly less. And what the problem, it seems to me, and you have it in this model really, is that all the other assumptions and evidence that are used in practice by politicians or to whoever the decision has been given are hidden, not explicit.
Yes.
So with glyphosate, there were quite clear views that industrial type farming would be impossible without it. That it was explicit in the discussions in the farming industry that if the most widely sold weed killer in the world was banned, it would send huge shockwaves through the farming industry, through which chemical farming might not recover. And that would be unacceptable.
Which is why the 18-month rule is allowed.
So,
It's been extended.
and why, when you look at what the Parliament and the Commission decided about glyphosate, they looked at some quite significant, like no use in public places and parks, no pre-harvest, no use of glyphosate immediately before you harvest wheat, for example, which are going to be ignored. But it's these judgments which are economic, social, political, which may be informed by other scientific disciplines and by social science, are all of them implicit and not explicit.
So you would say, I should say, Peter was the first ever Minister of the Environment in Britain, so I speak
Not
to
quite, but anyway, I was in the Department of Environment here.
very young. The issue again is back to Eric's principle of making things explicit rather than having
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And making explicit.
just by declarations of interest. It's got to be something
Yeah.
more
No.
significant. Remember, this is something really serious for us. How do we make explicit all the assumptions about diet and health? I mean, you're shaking your head. My brain's going fuzzy at the prospect.
Well, that's exactly Eric's point about lecithin. You can't ban lecithin because it's too important to the processed food industry. Companies like Unilever and Nestle depend on products like that. It's unthinkable politically to ban it, even if it's causing huge costs and obesity.
Emma and I, who are concerned, and Jane and other people here, who are concerned about the rise of what we call ultra-processed foods. Actually, this may be what has to happen in the next 10, 20 years. It may be unthinkable now.
I don't understand why you don't need the microphone, but we all do.
Can I? Sorry, I don't want to. If someone else is talking, I don't want to. Well, I'm sitting here thinking about an experience I had at WHO, the World Health Organization, when I chaired their committee on regulation of marketing of complementary foods. In other words, foods given to very young infants and very young children. And as chair, it was my job just to kind of chair the process, make sure we got the job done, which was drafting a set of regulations, which, not surprisingly, then got caught up in the political process and weren't adopted due to European opposition. But what was interesting about that process is I knew who was in the room. And there was a woman who is known to, a senior professor, known to get money from an industry. And there was an American woman, and there was a woman who's Egyptian, who was a paediatrician, and she had a sort of very practice-based approach. And then there was a range of other people in the room, including Helen Crawley, who's worked at the centre in the past, and who's an expert in this area. And what was really interesting for me as chair was that even though I understood the dynamics of who was industry and not industry, the things that were much more powerful were twofold. One was the narrative on whether kids should have fresh home-cooked foods or whether having processed foods was okay. And that was really the dominant dividing line between the people in the room. And the second thing was that even though I knew that someone had got funding from industry, which is fully declared, WHO have an extremely strict process about declaring, but because there are so few nutritional scientists who don't take money from industry, it's practically impossible to have a panel of experts who don't have, who don't have something. But this professor is a really good scientist. She might have different perspectives to whatever, but nevertheless, she's a good scientist. I had the impression that she just really believed in their own narrative. And so she'd got a bit of money from industry, but that's because she believed that was going to increase the marketability of these very nutrient-dense, highly processed products. Nevertheless, who got funded was not the most important thing in the dynamics of the meeting. What the most important thing was the rules set by WHO on the nature of using evidence for policy. So the discussions had to be about the evidence. Is there evidence to restrict up to the age of 3, or can we go? I mean, we spent a whole afternoon talking about whether we could restrict up to the age of 3 years the marketing of these products, or the age of 2. And it was all about the evidence. And every time tried to come back to anything different, we had to, by the rules which I had as chair, come back to say, what does the evidence say? And if the evidence appeared to be weaker, we just had to take it out. I mean, that was the rules. So in other words, what was more important was the rules set by the WHO, not whether somebody had got money from the food industry and somebody hadn't.
Thanks, Kuna. Can I respond to that? Firstly, no. Okay. Firstly, your question about, it's very hard to get some clean experts who haven't worked for industry. I mean, for me, that is an indictment of the reductions that there have been in public funding for research on issues like nutrition and chemical toxicology, and that have pushed academics and scientific researchers to work with the private sector in order to have some funding at all. And that's the reason there are so few experts with clean hands, is itself the result of a flawed political process. I mean, it's interesting you said, well, I had to follow the rules, and the rules were everything had to be evidence-based. That meant if no research had been conducted in the topic, or there was too little evidence, you couldn't do anything about it. Exactly. So that is part of the way in which, as it were, normative framing assumptions that reflect particular interest end up constraining what an expert committee is to do, even though it, as it were, that rule is represented as it's a scientific rule, but actually it's a policy rule that ties the hands of the scientists. You are inviting me to...
In 30 seconds.
So, 30 seconds. So quickly is... Fine, gentleman's got to leave. Is the chosen level of protection a suitable, useful benchmark? I think it is, because it's in a way of revealing what the objectives of public policy makers are, right, rather than leaving those implicit. On Brexit, of course, many of the people who voted for Brexit weren't voting for declining food standards, but many of the people who led the campaign to vote Leave favoured deregulatory agendas. You say, and your last question was about the progressive role of science, and of course, I do believe it can and should have a progressive role, but in order for it to do so, the conditions under which it operates needs to change substantially.
That's a very good way to end, actually. I'd like you to thank Eric, and I thank Eric very much.